Greetings, class, and welcome to Chapter 1, Biology, Exploring Life. In today's lesson, we will cover sections 1.1 to 1.3, the scientific study of life. We'll begin first by defining what biology is. Biology is a combination of two words, bio and ology. Remember, of course, you know from all your other science classes, ology means the study of, and then bio, the root word, of course, or the prefix, refers to life. So biology is the study of life. Now, how can you study life if you don't really have an understanding what the word life means? And I know if I had put a picture here and I asked, is this particular image living or is this image non-living? I'm sure most everybody watching this video would correctly guess which one was living and non-living. But then if I asked you to define life, that would be something completely different. That's a very challenging word. But what scientists have done is they've come up with a list of properties or characteristics that define life. To be considered living, you must have all these characteristics. So I'll highlight them here first, including order, reproduction, growth and development, energy processing, regulation, response to the environment, and evolutionary adaptation. And let's add one more to that. In addition to all those characteristics that we mentioned above, all living things are made of cells. Cells are what we call the basic units of structure and function in a living thing. By structure, we're of course talking about the building blocks, the things that make up a living thing, and then the functional units, we're talking about the cells taking care of all the things that have to be taken care of within an organism so the organism can survive. And so here's an example of all the different types of properties. I apologize, I think on the bottom you may not be able to see one of them, or maybe part of the second one. But let's start in the top left-hand corner with this plant. You can see this is an example of order, and in fact you can even see there's actually a particular type of order. We see symmetry here. This is called radial symmetry. We have multiple areas of symmetry that pass through a central point. And so this is a great example of order. We, of course, exhibit order as well as humans. We have what's called bilateral symmetry. So you'll find order in life. Living things also have the ability to reproduce and produce new offspring. Organisms can grow and develop, which means not only do they get bigger, they also get more complex and sophisticated. Organisms respond to their environment. We call that stimulus, which is the trigger, and the response is what the organism does as a result. Like, for example, turning on the lights at the top of a fish tank and watching the fish swim up to the top to get their food. All living things need to process energy. We call all these processes metabolism. All living things need to maintain a stable internal condition. That's this one here in the lower left-hand corner. We call that homeostasis. And all living things evolve and adapt over time to changes in their environment. Now, biologists have to make sense of all this life. There's so many different species. And scientists that are experts in doing that kind of work are called taxonomists. And what taxonomists do is they classify organisms, which means they put them into groups based on similar characteristics. And we call this branch of work systematics, which is the field of actually classifying organisms and putting them together in groups. Currently, scientists have created a system that looks something like this, kind of a pyramid in reverse. At the top level, you have the most inclusive groups, which are the domains. And at the lowest or the bottom level, we have the most exclusive groups. We call those the species. And each species level contains only one particular organism of that particular variety, one particular species, organisms that are similar to each other and can reproduce and produce live, viable offspring. So scientists currently take all the organisms on the planet and they divide them into one of three groups. These domains include the domain bacteria, archaea, which is like your ancient bacteria, and then the domain eukarya. Bacteria and archaea are prokaryotes, which means they don't contain nuclei, but they are quite different. That's why each one is in their own domain. And eukarya organisms that are eukaryotic, which means they have a nucleus. So if you see a cell and it has a nucleus inside of it, it's going to fit into one of these 4 groups, either protists, fungi, plants, or animals. So from there, then we go down the different levels of classification, going into kingdom, phylum, and so on and so forth, which we'll talk about more later in the year. But scientists have to make sense of all this life because there's just so much of it. And then here's a great image with the 3 different domains, your domain bacteria and archaea. Notice on the left-hand side and the right-hand side here, the magnifications. Those are small organisms. And then in the domain eukarya, you do have microscopic organisms, but then you also have organisms that are multicellular and can be seen with the unaided eye. Now, biologists do study life across a very broad range of scales. What does that mean? We're talking about from the tiniest structures all the way up to our entire planet. So biologists will basically start at the molecular level and work all their way up. In this particular class, we'll actually start even below that. Talk a little bit about chemistry. We'll look at atoms, those kind of things, as the building blocks of matter and the building blocks of molecules. And then from there, we'll look at molecules in terms of biological molecules, macromolecules, and then we'll continue building up throughout the remainder of the course. A very interesting term to discuss also is this idea of what are called emergent properties. And emergent properties we find in, say, for example, a living thing is a particular type of property that is dependent or based on the interaction of multiple component parts working together. And for an example, I gave you the fish. When the fish wriggles its tail when it's swimming, it doesn't just wriggle its tail. There's a whole interaction that has to take place from the message being sent from the brain through the nerves to the nerve endings that contact the muscles in the tail of the fish. And those muscles can contract and cause the fish to move. You also have the support of the bone. So it's all the interactions of those systems together create the emergent property, which is actually ultimately the fish moving. When we talk about the different levels of organization in our course, we're going to start here, and we're actually going to work our way up. In Chapter 2, we'll talk about atoms, and we'll do a little bit of chemistry. Then Chapter 3, we'll move into macromolecules and biochemistry. We'll look at the molecules of life. And then from there, we'll progress into the levels, getting more and more complex and more broad as we go along. We'll start looking at things like cells. Cells are made of organelles, which help them to function. Then, of course, cells compose tissues. Groups of tissues working together will create organs and organ systems. Organ systems together can create an organism. Then you have a group of organisms all together in one place. We call that a population. Then you might have different populations together in a particular area. We call that a community. And so you can see we're getting broader and broader. Now we're to the ecosystem itself. The ecosystem is the particular environment and all the organisms within the communities and the populations that are actually within that particular habitat. And then from there, we have all the ecosystems together make up the biosphere, which is our planet. Okay. And so that's where we'll stop for today. And in our next lesson, starting with section 1.4, we'll move into the processes of science. We'll start looking at the scientific method, the parts of the scientific method, inference versus observation, collecting data,